Hey everyone, I'm Matt Freedman, Matt F. the Oracle. Welcome to the 7th episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. Last week we talked about the impact of late-breaking NBA news on your DFS decisions. This week, with the launch of our new DFS PGA product, we're going to give an introduction to PGA for all of the novices out there. So let's get started. Our guest for the week is David Fraye, on Twitter at Jaberwalk. He's a DFS writer for Project Roto. He covers NFL, NBA, MLB, and of course PGA. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. I have a question. Why is it Jaberwalk instead of Jabberwock?
Well, you would pronounce it Jabberwock, but I threw the E in there just because when I went to go make a profile, it was taken. So I just threw the E in there just to be a little bit different.
Right. How dare they take that from you? But it's a good one. I like it. And it's good to have you on the show. Now, also.
Yeah, no, I would have thought Lewis Carroll would have had their monster taken already.
Yeah. All right. Also joining us, making the first appearance on the show, is Jon Cabezas. You can follow him on Twitter at KB24. He's a writer for FantasyLabs and a golf degenerate. Jon, I'm pretty sure I screwed up your last name. Why don't you tell me how I should have said it?
You did much better on the practice run.
I did.
It's Cabezas.
Cabezas, right. Yeah. All right. Well,
thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you on the show. And at the end of the show, I will try to get your name right, although the odds are I will get it wrong. It's really tradition,
Yeah.
All right. And then finally, making his roundtable debut is Colin Davy at ADJ Baseline, as in Adjusted Baseline. That's where you can follow him on Twitter. I don't know if you should. I think he might be worse on Twitter than I am, and that's saying a lot because I am pretty bad. He's the director of the PGA product at FantasyLabs and the two-time, one might even say all-time, winner of the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference Hackathon. Colin, tell me why the most useless metric in the world is strokes gained.
Oh man, no one's gonna let me live this down for a while. So I'm sure we're gonna be talking about it for the next month or so. The case against strokes gained compared to conventional data is that the bullet point version is one, you can do as well as strokes gained pretty much with conventional data with the proper adjustments. Two, the stuff you can't do as well doesn't predict DFS success as much as you might think it does. And three, there are gaps in strokes gained from non-PGA tournaments that people don't explicitly adjust for. So in terms of a single data source, I'd rather just work my magic with conventional data and squeeze as much as I can out of it than deal with the gaps in strokes gained.
Understood, and that was a fantastic elevator pitch, very fine-tuned. You'll have lots of opportunities to unleash that on the Twitter sphere for the next, however many months. All right, it's great to have you guys on the show. Let's jump into it. Just this week, FantasyLabs launched our new PGA product. It has the same look as all of the other products. It has the models with optimizers. You can generate a lot of lineups at once. You can still test your theories, back test all of them in our trend section. There's a lot to like, but many of our subscribers are new to PGA. They need some guidance on how to use the data and tools and really how to approach PGA DFS in general. So guys, let's pretend that right now you're explaining PGA DFS to someone who knows almost nothing about golf. And then let's pretend, and it's not that hard to pretend, that the person is me. David, let's start with you. What are the strategies of other DFS sports that are applicable to PGA?
Okay, so I thought about this for a little while, and the best answer I came up with is the more golfers you have playing on the weekend, the more points you will potentially score. And so I would equate that with minutes played in NBA, at-bats in MLB, and then targets or opportunity in NFL. So when you're looking at your 6 golfers for the week, you want to look at the 6 who will get you the most points. And to do so, the path to those points are 24 rounds of golf or 4 rounds per golfer.
All right, interesting stuff there. Colin, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess the thing I think where it's a little bit different is in NBA, minutes played is kind of a stable quantity that you can predict ahead of time. At bats, if you know lineup orders, is something you can also kind of know ahead of time. In PGA, the central challenge is, yes, you want to pick guys who are going to make the cut and play the most holes by far. The difference is you don't necessarily know who's going to make the cut ahead of the time because that's the nature of the sport. So I think the cut is kind of the fundamental wrench in the process that everyone has to deal with PGA in general. How do you adjust the data for dealing with the cut? How do you interpret long-term results? How do you deal with that massive amount of noise and variance that the cut throws in? And there's subjective and objective ways to deal with that. But it's really kind of getting your head around the cut just makes it different than a lot of other sports and just having strategy to deal with that.
Pat, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm John.
Sorry, it says Pat on your screen.
I know. I set you up for that one. That was worse than the last name.
That was worse. You know what? Maybe I can just call you Jeff for the rest of the show. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, that's fine. One of the similarities that I see and use is more in the game theory side of things when projecting ownership in GPPs, whereas it's closer to NFL than it would be in NBA. Whereas if Russell Westbrook's playing and Kevin Durant's sitting, no matter what I project his ownership at, I'm probably going to play him. He's just in such a plus spot. Whereas in NFL, if somebody's ownership starts approaching 40, 45%, then that automatically makes me start to look at fading that player just because of the volatility. And that's the similar in PGA. Whereas if I project a player to be 20, 25% owned, then that's almost an automatic fade, and it's definitely warranting me to look into fading.
Yeah, I'd actually agree with that too. I think ownership, especially in GPPs, are far more important because usually ownership correlates with everybody as a surefire lock. This player is going to go off. Like there's a certainty around like they're going to do really well. In golf, because of that cut and because of the huge variance involved, you will never have that certainty. Even the top guys miss cuts way more often than you think there were. So there's no such thing. I think ownership is actually probably the most important of golf, just because it doesn't correlate with like the level of guaranteed success that it does in other sports. So the payoff for going contrarian is actually higher in golf for GPPs.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest things I take in every single week is weighing the ownership, and even in cash games. If I know someone is going to be 40 or 50 or even 60% owned, I will more likely fade that player because of the volatility of the sport. And so I completely agree with what you're saying there.
All right. Well, obviously PGA is different than a lot of the other sports in that it's not a team game. Also, in the way that it's played, you're not competing in space against other people. They're not trying to like prevent you from scoring a touchdown or scoring a basket. You have, free ability to act. So how do those qualities of PGA impact the way you analyze it? John, what do you think? And I got your name right.
Nice. I still think there is an element of that, whereas you don't have Kawhi Leonard attempting to block your shot or locking you down on defense, but you're still competing against a field. Whereas, so you still have this field who's trying to block you from getting, whether it's a first place finish, a top 5, making the cut. The biggest difference in that is if a pitcher gives up, if a Major League Baseball team scores 10 runs in the first inning, that's only hurting the opposing pitcher. Whereas if a player goes out there and posts 10 under through the first 2 rounds, that's affecting the entirety of the field, which is then going to affect the way they approach the game, and so on and so forth. And those top finishes are so important, specifically in GPPs, because of the bonuses that are involved, where you get 30 points for first place. I think it's 20 for second, 18 for third. I was actually looking at the winning lineup of the 3-wood last week, and the guy who won that had the first, second, and third place finishers, which was good for 68 additional points in bonuses alone. So you really are scratching and clawing to get to the top of that leaderboard. I mean, those points alone, I have 2 players on my lineup in that GPP who are at like 14 and 18% owned. And total, I think they scored 40 points. So he outscored them just in bonuses from his 3 players who finished at the top of the leaderboard. So there still is this aspect of not necessarily somebody defending you physically, but they are, in essence, blocking you from those bonuses and from those cuts. So you could look at the field the same way you would look at maybe an opponent plus minus in NBA or something like that.
Colin, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're so right where they're like you don't have, there's no one blocking you, and I guess the kind of there's less covariance and correlated outcomes in golf, and I think that makes it easier to attack from a purely mathematical perspective. I think the good GPP players in other sports are like who can take into account, well, if this lineup goes off, then that means that highly owned pitcher will go down, and that'll hurt the rest of the field, and there's all these interactive effects that you have to consider in every single other sport. Whereas like if, let's say, like that Rory wins, he gets his 30 bonus points in DK, yeah, that means that like everyone else can get 26 tops, but that correlated effect isn't there nearly as much. So what does that mean for your decision-making process? Well, if you're good at putting together correlated outcomes and you think that's an edge that you have, that kind of goes away. But if that's not something you want to do and you want to attack it purely from a mathematical or data perspective, your decision-making process is a lot easier. So it fits a slightly different playing style depending on what you think you're good at.
Makes a lot of sense. David, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the only sports that correlation comes from within your own lineup. If you can correlate those 6 golfers into making the cut, you will have a chance at cashing highly in that GPP, especially if you have the winner and a couple other top 10s. Like, for example, myself, last month, I actually had a very high finish in a GPP, and I didn't even have the winner. I had a very lucky ace on the 16th hole of a green, and it got me 10 points for that ace alone, which basically is the 10 additional points that the winner would get over a second-place finish. And so that propelled me above and beyond all of those other players because the winner kind of came out of nowhere and was a very low-owned player that week. So I think when we're talking about stuff like this, the correlation is within your own lineup, and you don't actually really need to worry as much about your competition or the competition on the field. If your lineup is going to get the most points, you have the best opportunity to win a lot of money.
Yeah, David, to expand on your idea of correlation within the lineup, like I think a practical way that plays out, and really one of the only ways in golf, because it really is a bunch of independent actors in your lineup, is something like weather conditions. I know we'll talk about this more down the road, but there is this whole like the tee times are different. Like there's a Thursday AM, Friday PM, and Thursday PM, Friday AM, and some of the groups are going to experience the same weather conditions. So if you believe that one half has an edge to the other, that's kind of a natural way. That's the closest thing to, I guess, like stacking in golf and kind of correlating success of everybody in your lineup. If you want to do like a weather stack where you take everyone from one half of the tee time, that's the way that that should kind of come out naturally when you're kind of doing your FantasyLabs models. But I think that's if you believe that there's edge in one half, that's kind of a way where you can correlate outcomes within your own lineup.
Now, Colin, a follow-up on this. So you just mentioned weather as a potential a factor, not really a statistic, but a factor that someone would take into account when constructing a lineup. And we might be venturing into contentious territory, but what are some of the standard statistics or factors in the industry and the way that you think they should be used? Or phrased differently, what statistics do you find significant?
So I think the way I approach the stats game is like it's kind of a three-parter. One, kind of develop your comprehensive base ranking of how do you know a golfer's overall skill level. Two, take into account their player stats and how they might do a course fit. And three, that kind of weather. So it's a three-parter. And the first part is, I guess, the good one to focus on because it's the subject of so much discussion these days. I think any metric that tells you how golfers did relative to other people in the field is a good starting point. I think kind of absolute scoring in draft, essentially fantasy points per game, like average that is not a good metric because course conditions change so often and the field changes so often. So developing something that tells you how people do relative to other golfers is a good statistic. I think strokes gains is one of those statistics that tells you how people do relative to everyone else in the field. So I'm not hating on it like in the abstract. I just think there are better ways to capture the value of strokes gain that don't that aren't missing gaps in data. After that, I think you can take player stats and kind of do the same thing where you see I think driving distance is okay as far as like deciding if someone's a bomber or not, if that's a good course fit. I think driving distance relative to the field is a better way to look at that kind of thing because it adjusts for course difficulty and field difficulty. So I guess the single philosophy is more just look at how everyone does relative to the field instead of just absolute numbers.
Jon.
I mean, I really agree with that because there really is only three things I think you can consider competing against our golfers, and it would be the field, the weather, and the course. So anytime you can have a statistic that adjusts for any of those three things, then I think you're going to gain a leg up than just looking at average points per game or average DraftKings points per round or anything like that. Because those are really the only three things that can have a genuine effect, or at least a large enough effect to matter on any given round. Is the weather, the field, and the course, because some courses, and Colin alluded to this, some courses set up better for a player like Bubba Watson who can hit the ball 330 yards. Some courses set up better for a guy who's going to hit his greens in regulation and avoid trouble. So if you don't have the statistics adjusting for those things, then it's going to be very easy to be led in the wrong direction when you're looking to see who you want to select.
Mm-hmm. David, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I think we're hitting the nail on the head here because for each course is going to be different each week. And say a specific course is ranked the most difficult to hit greens on tour. And so you're going to expect golfers to hit them at a 45 to 55% clip that week. And so then the next week they play at a course where they can hit greens at 75 to 80% clip. So you're going to have a completely different outcome for certain golfers because what happens if a golfer does not play on the hard course? He plays on the easy course. His stats are going to be inflated. And then vice versa if the golfer plays on the easy, just the other way around. So I think we're hitting the nail on the head there. And that's why with these stats that we have, there's a lot more noise than there is signal. And so we have a long way to go, but I think we're starting to get there.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss if I didn't plug the product, by the way. The FantasyLabs Player Models does all those adjustments for you behind the scenes. So if you're ever looking for a source where all the conventional stuff is adjusted for you, FantasyLabs.com.
And I have to say it's not surprising at all that the guy with the Twitter handle adjusted baseline is talking about adjusted statistics. Very much what we should expect. Now, I'm curious, what are some of the common misconceptions that people might have about PGA DFS? I guess phrased differently, what are some of the ways in which people commonly make mistakes? David, what do you think?
I think the biggest thing I've seen is the hot hand theory, where I guess in golf it would be called recent form. So if a golfer finishes 15th, 22nd, 10th, 19th over the last, he's going to be higher owned than, say, if he has two missed cuts and finished 50th twice. And so is it correct to roster him on that fifth week? It's not always the case because the way I do research and the way that I think research should be done is that you should adjust for the course, adjust for the player, and adjust for the weather. And going off of recent form on completely different courses, I think is just it's just a dumb way to go about things. And I think, yes, there is a certain case to be made for a player who is, hitting everything within 3 feet. But I think that more often than not, it's a lot more noise than anything.
I know it's supposed to be a discussion of that. I I get the hot hand fallacy actually, but that's one of the cases where I might actually disagree there. When I started building some of these models, I came in like looking to disprove the hot hand fallacy, and that's kind of like, okay, what time results do you weight when, and kind of what order? At least relative to other sports, like say basketball, for example, I think the hot hand is not nearly as much as a fallacy. Now, I think there's like, it's how much like there's two questions: how much do you weight recent results, and how much do other people value recent results? I will agree that people probably overvalue recent results relative to prices and how much they're actually worth, but it's not as much as you might think. I think there is a case for like the recent results matter in golf more than others. And I think my mistake I was actually going to go with would be something like the value of course fit. David, I don't know what your weights are in terms of, like long-term form versus recent form, generics, like rating versus course specific and fit like that. I think most people put course fit as like maybe like 30% important, and I put it closer to 10%. So, I mean, it's a back and forth, and, we can hash it out, but yeah.
I'm more on the other side of that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any correct answer.
Yeah, exactly. And people are people are going to view this differently. And for me, it comes down a bit to game theory. I am a fan of recent form. I mean, it's not the only thing I look at, but that's one of the cool things about FantasyLabs is David, like you said, if I'm looking at recent form, the courses of the last 6 weeks may all be different. The field might be different. There's all these elements of noise, whereas the statistics we're dealing with at FantasyLabs are adjusted for those things. So now I'm able to put a little bit more faith in some of these recent form stats that we have available. And the other thing is it could offer us a look into players to fade, whereas some players who are appearing good when you just strictly look at how they finished in the last 6 tournaments or 10 tournaments, they might look really good on paper, but when you adjust for those different things, you realize that they're not really playing as well as we think relative to the field, which can offer us value in being off of a player who might be highly owned where he shouldn't. Matt Every could be a perfect example of that this week, with coming off of 2 wins in his last 2 appearances at Bay Hill, but he's really done nothing of late to make me feel any comfort in rostering him coming into this tournament.
Yeah, I think the context, the agreement underlying all of these things is put everything in context. That we're all like that. That's the road we're kind of all leading down towards. You can do that by thinking critically, or you can do it by stats adjustment. Either way, I think we can all agree that most people, when they're playing DFS, don't put enough results in proper context.
Yeah, and I think the second factor that you had mentioned there, the value that people are giving to certain factors, that really is I think the key, and I think that's also where game theory can enter in, because it's more than just what does this factor mean. It's how does the field in which you are competing value the factors under consideration. Now, Jon, a question here is, PGA is unique in that the DFS competition, it takes place over a number of days, and all the action occurs within a single tournament in which everyone competes against each other. That stands in juxtaposition to other sports where you have multiple games that take place on one day in which 2 opponents compete directly. How do those differences, impact the DFS decisions you make, and how do those factors in general influence the PGA tournament on which your DFS game is based?
I think, I kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, but I think it's in respect to the fact that these things impact everyone. Like I said, weather is going to impact the morning tee times, and in the afternoon, weather is going to impact everyone who tees up in the afternoon. So there's less to dig through, whereas on a NBA slate, it was 9 games tonight, I think, we're looking at 9 different actually we're looking at 18 different teams and how they defend, and then we're looking at the individual players and how they defended by position. That's really eliminated, so it saves a sense of time in that. But I also, and kind of what you said preceding the question, was I feel like some people might weigh those things too heavily, where they're looking at weather or a thing like that that's affecting the entire field, and they're putting so much stock in it that I can actually have an advantage over them, specifically in GPPs, by just not weighing it as heavy as the field.
Yeah, Pat, I think you pretty much nailed it on the head. It simplifies stuff. So if you're if like you're looking to play other sports and you don't want to deal with weather at 15 different stadiums and wind conditions like NFL or something like that, you have one thing to focus on. So maybe it's a little bit funner to play DFS golf instead of NFL, where there's just too much to worry about. And to your point, if you're coming from NFL and you're used to worrying about 30 different things and, oh my God, I have to focus. If your attention is newly focused on just a single place, you may hone in on those exact factors because you're used to trying to take into account for everything. So it's really easy on that same note to kind of focus on the noise and the superfluous where like it may not necessarily be there. I think to that point, people like would be better served before they hone in on their thing, just really checking like A, is it predictive of future value? And B, is this something that other people are looking at?
David, do you have any thoughts on that?
Nothing other than it's just we're just striving to find that perfect balance of context. And I think, John, you made a perfect point there. So.
So we've already touched on this next question, but it's my favorite question in the outline. So we're going to go ahead and touch on this again. PGA, it's unlike any other sport, but it's actually a lot like NASCAR in certain ways in that the physical dimensions of the field of competition, so a course in PGA, a racetrack in NASCAR, those physical dimensions have significance. But really the question is, how big of a factor is the course in the outcome of the actual competition? And then how big of a factor should the course be in the DFS decisions that you make when you're constructing your lineups? Colin, what do you think?
So we kind of touched on it earlier, but I think course fit is like roughly analogous to something like DVP in NBA, where it's kind of an add-on to your kind of base rating of like, all right, with NBA, minutes, usage rate, the very predictable stuff that kind of start like your base rating for projected points. DVP is kind of like, it's almost like a 10%er adjustment on like how are the specifics going to affect them here, and that context you have to account for. So, and that's consistent with other people who've just done like short-term forecasting of golf tournaments where they say like, how much does like course fit matter? It's consistent with kind of like the pure analytics research that's been done in golf. So if you want to, in a simple number, 10%. That's how much I think course fit accounts for.
David, do you have any thoughts there?
No, I agree with pretty much whatever he said. Yeah, I didn't really have anything for that question.
Okay. John, any thoughts there?
Again, I agree with Colin. It seems like the theme of the show is going to be putting everything in context, because I think that's what Colin's talking about really is, if I do see that a course sets up well for players who can hit it long off the tee and driving distance is a statistic that I may want to focus on, it's still only going to account for a small number of what I actually care about it and how much it's going to pressure me or perceive into my selection of players that week. And again, it's also something that I feel like if we're going to use Colin's 10% number, I do think most people have a higher number than that. So it's advantageous to take advantage of that, whereas maybe a course does set up well for the long hitters. That doesn't mean I really want to weigh too much on them, primarily being a GPP player, because I know everyone else is doing that as well. So I may use it as a tiebreaker, I may factor it in a little bit, but really what I use is if I see that, then I might try to find players who, the statistics are almost artificial in driving distance because they're not adjusted or there's not a large sample, just so I can take advantage of fading them.
Yeah, and I guess there's a kind of a practical example this week at Bay Hill actually, it's not quite the same as course fit, but course history is kind of like the cousin to course fit. Like aside from their descriptive stats and what types of players do well to course, you can also see how that individual golfer has done at that course over time. And Ryan Palmer, I think, is one of the most interesting cases here this week because normally he grades out for me as like an overall like top 25 golfer, but he has a pretty bad course history here. So like he's normally priced at like around like 8,700, 9,000. He's at under 8,000 this week. And so you get to weigh that and say, like, everybody, like, when they're rostering when they're making their rostering decisions, they always focus on, oh, they've had a good course history here. Oh, they're a really good fit, without asking if it's priced in. But no one does the reverse, where they say they have a bad course history here, but they're still a pretty good player. Are they being priced too low? And I think that kind of analysis is something that's it's very friendly to kind of just having models and having stats and kind of having your sliders and saying, okay, who pops? I can see why they're like that. I think that's a pretty defensible narrative. What do you do when an overall good player doesn't have a great course history? Is he undervalued? I think that's one of the easier ones to agree on.
I agree with that as well. And it kind of points to something I talked about it a bit in an article this week, the question of, does course history matter? And I said, of course it matters, just because everybody else thinks it matters.
Yeah. Yes, that alone, I agree.
The analogy I used was, if you told me that, everybody thinks the color of a player's pants matters, do you think it matters? I'd say yes. If everybody thinks it matters, then I am going to pay attention to it. And because kind of like the opposite of what you were talking about, there might be a subpar golfer who has this, the last 3 times he's played at Bay Hill, maybe he's performed well and has a top 10, a top 20, and a top 50. And I know people are going to see that. They're going to look at that. But really, that would be the only thing pushing anyone towards playing that golfer. His recent form doesn't set up well. Maybe his long-term form doesn't set up well. And there's really no other reason to play him. And I know his ownership is going to be inflated because of how much people are weighing that. So, and I do weigh it. I'll pay attention to that. If there's some people that have really good course history. I think Ian Poulter has 5 top 25 finishes his last 5 times at Bay Hill. But I'm not going to play him because of that. But if I'm stuck between Ian Poulter and another golfer at his price, then I might factor that in when I'm looking at a tiebreaker or something like that, specifically in cash games. But it definitely matters to the public, and I know it's talked about a lot, and people weigh it heavily. And, in my opinion, probably more heavy than they should. So it's something that, again, in tournaments, I think that all of us can take advantage of.
Yeah, John, I think since you're a big GPP guy and more cash, I think you should start looking into people with bad course history, because that's one of the surefire signs of suppressing ownership and going. I mean, no one will pick up someone with bad course history, and if you don't think it matters as much as it should, and it's kind of a tiebreaker, that's one of the easiest. Maybe you drop a little bit in expected points, but you drop massively in ownership. Nobody picks up a person with bad course history at any price. That seems like an opportunity to me in GPPs.
I agree completely. Just for example, take Billy Horschel at the Honda a couple of weeks ago. He came into the Honda with absolutely putrid course history, and he was underpriced. I think he was under about 8% owned in GPPs. And I loaded up on him. He finished 8th that week. And that's just because Billy Horschel is a good golfer. He hits greens. And just because he has a bad course history does not mean that he's going to have a bad tournament.
Yep, perfect example.
David, kind of going off of that, so you have these lineups in PGA of only 6 spots, much lower in number than a lot of the other sports. And so it seems like you have to, maybe make harder decisions because you're allocating so much more to any one spot in your lineup. What impact does the number of players you can put in your lineup have on the process that you use in constructing your lineups?
Well, I take 2 completely different approaches to constructing lineups. For cash games, I will be more balanced. And balanced means I'm going to more focus on players in the 7 to 9K range rather than the top 5 favorites for that tournament. Because as we've mentioned here, multiple times, the most important thing in golf is to get 6 players through the cut. If you get 6 players through the cut, you are most likely cashing. You will most definitely cash in double ups, in 50-50s. Especially in my 2 years of playing DFS, have ever gotten a 6 of 6 through in a cash game and failed to cash that. And it could be because of the variance of the sport. It could be because we don't necessarily know how to look at the data as well as we know how to look at it in MLB or NBA. So there's you have a little bit more lenience there. But for cash games, if I'm looking at more of a balanced approach, I'm trying to get myself with 6 golfers on the weekend. And for GPPs, I will more likely roster 1 or 2 of the favorites and then dig down in the bargain area for 1 or 2 of those 6K guys who are going to pop up and hit a top 10 or a top 15. And you're going to take on a whole lot more risk because you're dealing with players with longer odds. You're dealing with players with a lot more variance in their own game, and so they're more likely to miss the cut. But you are taking the stab at the Rory McIlroys and the Jordan Spieth of winning that tournament and scoring the most points, and you're trying to pair that with the more high variant players.
Yeah, I think that's broadly similar to kind of how I approach cash. Since I'm primarily cash, I also focus more on balance, but it's more because, as I alluded to earlier, there's no such thing as a safe cash game play in golf. Everybody misses the cut more often than you thought. And so there's no way to justify spending a lot of money. I almost never spend $11,000 on a single player and cash lineup just because there's they never offered that level of guarantee. And I think one of the concepts that gets discussed frequently is this kind of can you trade upside for increased chance of just getting across the cut? Are there these guys that don't necessarily stand a chance to win every week but just make the cut consistently? I think there are. I think the way you kind of and then the way you naturally find them is, we've put all this stuff around put results in context. I think another example we haven't touched on are people who miss the cut by 1 stroke, or less than 2 strokes, when they miss the cut a lot. Those are people whose relative scores will pop decently high. It's not like they're missing the cut by 7 strokes. But maybe they just get unlucky one week. So if they're always close and they score generally well, those people usually make the cut a little bit more. And they cover kind of closer to that, they're never going to win, but they'll put up solid finishes more often than not. And that pops, I think those players pop organically once you kind of start using stats adjusted for the proper context. So that's I think that's the backbone of my cash strategy.
Jon, let's go to you. You're more of a GPP player, so let's talk about tournaments. You can't stack in PGA. How do you build lineups for GPPs? How do you go about finding volatility?
There's a few ways that I'll do that. For example, this week I'm doing more lineups than I typically do. So what I've done with a large percentage of those is I went and I looked for a core group of players who I thought would be low owned, who I liked. And I actually locked in 3 of them, which isn't much if you're thinking NFL and MLB, but that's 50% of my lineup. And I locked those 3 in and then built all of my lineups around them, really paying not much mind at that point to projected ownership. I was focusing just on the upside because I felt like I had locked in being contrarian with my first 3 players that I was using my core. And I also think that in GPPs, PGA almost begs you to take the stars and scrubs approach, just because the best golfers and the golfers with the highest upside are priced at the top of the pricing. So it really begs of you to do that. So I think a natural way to be contrarian is to simply, you can focus in that cash game style by taking the mid-range price guys, but targeting the ones that may be lower owned. So you'll naturally have a different roster construction in the field just by not going after the stars and scrubs approach, because it's really easy to take the top 2 price guys, take 2 guys between 5,500 and 6,500, and then 2 guys in 7K range. Almost every week you can do a lineup that's going to fit those parameters. And it really does, at least in my experience, it asks me to do that. So sometimes I'll just resist that urge and simply put a lineup together that's really, really balanced, yet contrarian by targeting the lower players.
Yeah, I think that's a really sensible GPP approach, especially if you can lock in a contrarian core, so to speak. It's pretty easy to do that in PGA just because a lot of these guys are especially if people are playing mostly household names, a common process is they figure out how expensive the top guys are, and they'll get scared off. People do get scared off by high price tags, I think, in PGA more so than than other sports. And so that makes it, if you kind of have an inkling of who those people are, oh no, they're not that good, they're way too expensive, that's a great contrarian core. And then kind of those filler people, like who's going to fill out the rest of my 3? Like, yeah, you're throwing darts essentially, because like, you know that like there's always going to be some scrubs that go off. You can kind of piece together who they might be. But just like the scrubs, you can get it's so easy. Like once you get into the sub 6K range of picking someone who's less than 1% owned, because there are a lot of people that people don't know. That's when I think that I think contrarian core and stat driven scrubs, as far as like who has the best leading indicators of who's going to pop, I think that's a decent 1-2 for GPP. I'll take your word for it though, because you're way more of a GPP player than I am.
Well, what you said too is that people just don't know PGA golfers. The public is not familiar with players on the PGA Tour. And I play a lot of golf. I watch a lot of golf. And there's still players. I look at their name and I'm like, who is that guy? And I watch almost every tournament every weekend. Just one, because there's so many players, but the public really just doesn't know who a lot of these guys are.
Right. If you just think about who makes the TV times and when people are watching, like it's going to be on Saturday and Sunday, so only people who are making the cut. So like you really there's no other way to watch every single hole other than stats and get into the data. Like that's the only way, like realistically, because otherwise you're literally limited by what's on TV, and that's a very artificial view into knowing some of these golfers.
All right, guys, good show. We're going to go around the table one more time. Final words of wisdom. David, what do you have?
You're going to start with me. I just think the most important thing with DFS for PGA is just trying to nail those 3 core guys every single week. If you can nail 3 core guys who will finish in the top 15, you will pretty much nail your games, even if it's and depending on the week, you can even nail some GPPs with a missed cut or 2. It's happened multiple times in the past couple months and over the last year. So I really think the most important thing to do is focus on your 3 core guys and build around those guys.
All right, John, final words of wisdom.
I think this is almost for any DFS sport, but we haven't mentioned it yet, and how important it is just to simply think for yourself. And I think maybe even more so in PGA, where there's less articles, there's less analysis, people aren't talking about it as much, whereas in NFL, it's on every TV, it's on every website, who to play, who to pick. In PGA, that's a limited number, so people are really going to be swayed by that, and it's easy to allow yourself to be swayed by that. And just by simply thinking for yourself, you can end up being contrarian and getting away from the pack and finding some players who may be being overlooked. And, in relation to FantasyLabs, for example, it's like, yes, the pro trends are great, and I look at those, but the first thing I did on Monday night actually is I started making my own trends. And I ended up putting out a doo-doo cash game lineup for NBA that night because I got lost. It was like 6:30, and Sheriff Bill hit me up and asked me something. I was like, oh my God, I haven't set my lineup yet. So, I made my own trends, and I ended up seeing, I think this week I have a guy with, he has 7 trends that I've created, and I think he only has like 2 or 1 of the pro trends. And, that way I know people are looking at that. They're looking at the pro trends, may not look at this person, but the work I've done on my own and thinking for myself is going to allow me to identify some value where other people may be missing it. So I really can't overstate how important it is to at least begin the week thinking for yourself and coming up with plays on your own. And then you can take in a little bit of the group think and see if you've missed something. But there is, specifically GPPs, has a huge value.
Colin, closing thoughts.
So I think one of the most common frustrations people first have when they start playing golf is you're going to run into a weekend where you only get 2 or 3 guys that make it through the cut. And there's just always frustration inevitable with everyone of, this is a crapshoot. I can't tell who's going to make it. There's no such thing as anything safe. And people just kind of assume it's all random. No, it's not. And I just think that's because the level of analysis is not like it is as it is with the other big 3. And there are good ways to cut through that randomness. The big one that we mentioned a lot during this podcast is put everything in its proper context. I think adjust for the field, adjust for the difficulty. Everything should be adjusted so everything is relative, and that happens with context. The other one is between the noise inherent to the sport, I think with golf especially and the small sample sizes involved, you can't afford to miss out on any information. A lot of these golfers, and this is kind of the third point of the whole strokes gained diatribe, like a lot of these golfers are playing events outside of PGA and outside of this conveniently packaged statistics you might get on PGAtour.com. I think it behooves everyone to broaden their scope of their research and incorporate all the information from all of the other tours. There's web.com, there's Euro, there's Asian, there's so much more information that you can't afford to ignore because it's such a noisy sport. So whatever that research process might be, whether it's through FantasyLabs or figuring out how to translate Euro and web stats into PGA, you really can't afford to miss any information. So broaden this research beyond like what you may have seen in standard write-ups and processes.
And Colin, I salute you on your use of the word behooves. I think that's probably the first time in Roundtable history we've had that word busted out. So
like a Pee Wee Herman thing, everyone gets screams. It's the word of the day. I unlocked it. Like, awesome. Well, I'm happy to help.
Exactly. Now that we've got that word, it's time to close the show down. Guys, thanks for being on the Roundtable. We appreciate your taking the time to be with us. We've been speaking with David Fraye, Jon Cabezas. Did I get that right? I screwed it up. Can you say your name for me? Cabezas, Jon Cabezas. Next time you are on the show, I will butcher it a little bit less. That is what I can promise you. And we've also been speaking.
I have to work on my intro. Like Colin has all these really cool like accolades and things he's accomplished, and I'm just kind of like the guy who writes. Next time, why don't you just give me like random FantasyLabs people's accolades, like Jon Cabezas, the man behind the fan model, author of fantasy books for smart people. Like just throw random ones at me.
Dude, just win the birdie instead, and then it'll be like birdie winner Jonathan Cabezas, and then it's
done.
Yeah, exactly. That sounds good. So win some GPP and then come back to the show. And, of course, we've been speaking with Colin Davy as well. You can follow all these guys on Twitter at Jabberwock, at Cabay24, and ADJ Baseline. And you can follow me on Twitter at Matt F. The Oracle. I'm Matt Freedman, and this has been the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. Thanks for tuning in.